In a quiet corner of the city, there was a bustling laboratory teeming with the sharp smells of chemicals and the occasional crackle of experiments coming to life. Amidst this controlled chaos, a young man named Daniel and a girl named Sophie shared not only a workspace, but also a love so profound it seemed unshakable. Side by side, wearing their lab coats, they spent their days immersed in science, their shared passion drawing them closer with each passing hour. Everyone who worked in the lab noticed their connection. The way Daniel would glance at Sophie when she wasn't looking, or how her laughter seemed to ring clearer when he was nearby. It was obvious, magical even. Though they hadn't formally spoken about their future, Daniel knew one thing. She was the one he wanted to grow old with. He would do whatever it took to make her happy. One chilly afternoon, while the sun dipped low and cast a golden hue across the city, Daniel made a pivotal decision. He slipped out of the lab early, walking briskly to the town's most renowned jewelry store. His budget wasn't extravagant, just enough for a modest but elegant ring that he felt perfectly captured Sophie's essence: simple, radiant, enduring. As the jeweler polished the delicate band with a small, sparkling diamond seated in its center, Daniel's heart brimmed with excitement. He imagined the look on her face when he asked her to be his forever. But fate, cruel and indifferent, had other plans that day. Back at the laboratory, Sophie was leaned over a workstation, focusing intensely on a test involving volatile chemicals. Her hands were steady, but the tiniest destabilization, a tremor in the air perhaps, caused the vial in her hand to wobble. Before she could react, the liquid inside splashed upward, a small, volatile droplet landing in her eyes. A sharp scream ripped through the lab. Her colleagues rushed to her side. Daniel wasn't there to hear it. He was still walking back, rehearsing how he'd kneel, how he'd tell her she meant the world to him. Sophie was rushed to the hospital, her coworkers' hushed voices filled with panic and helplessness. When Daniel finally reached the empty lab and learned what had occurred, his heart froze, and the ring box slipped from his grasp, tumbling to the cold, tiled floor. Overcome with dread, he raced to the hospital. But by the time he arrived, the doctors had grim news. Sophie's eyes couldn't be saved. The chemical had caused irreversible damage. The bright, vibrant world she'd known would now be lost in darkness. The next days were an endless haze for Sophie. She struggled to process her sudden blindness, glued to her hospital bed, silent tears tracing her cheeks. And yet, even in her darkest moments, there was one face she longed to see, or at least hear: Daniel's. She whispered his name through her heartbreak, but he never appeared. Unbeknownst to her, Daniel was making a choice. Late one evening, while Sophie silently slept, he approached the hospital staff with an extraordinary offer. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled as he explained, "I want to donate my eyes." The doctors were stunned. "Do you understand what this means?" one asked gently. "Your life will change forever." Daniel nodded resolutely. "Her world has already gone dark. I can't let that happen if I have the power to give it back. Please, just don't tell her it was me." And that was it. No fanfare, no hesitation. The surgery was arranged, and soon Sophie's sight was restored. When she blinked her new eyes open for the first time, her chest surged with gratitude for the nameless donor who had given her life back. But even though the world before her was now vivid and bright, it all felt dim, because Daniel, her Daniel, had vanished. She searched for him everywhere. She left messages with their colleagues. She scoured the streets and places they'd been together. The coffee shop where he always insisted on buying her a latte. The park where they'd once sat for hours sharing dreams they were too shy to say out loud. But he was nowhere to be found. Months passed, and the absence ached like an open wound that wouldn't heal. Sophie couldn't let go. Though life was inching forward, her heart remained tethered to memories of him. And then one day, a chance comment from a mutual acquaintance pointed her in the direction of a small, secluded neighborhood. It was a late autumn afternoon when Sophie found herself in front of an unassuming house at the edge of town. Her footsteps felt heavier with each step toward the garden gate. She hesitated, gathering her courage before walking through. There he was, sitting on a wooden bench beneath the shade of a tree whose leaves had just started to fall. He was thinner than she remembered, his usual neatly groomed appearance replaced with frazzled stubble. And he was wearing sunglasses, even though the sunlight was barely peeking through the clouds. What caught her off guard, though, was the trail of tears streaming silently from beneath those glasses. "Daniel?" she called, her voice cracking from emotion. His whole body tensed, as though recognizing her instantly. Slowly, he turned his head toward her voice, but didn't say a word. In fact, he almost seemed to shrink back. He brushed at his cheeks hastily, as if terrified she'd catch him crying, though the evidence was impossible to hide. "Why?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, choked with equal parts relief and sorrow. "Why did you leave me?" Daniel opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, he turned away, clenching invisible fists as if wrestling with a flood of emotions too overwhelming to express. Sophie stepped closer, desperate for answers, and then she saw it. The slight reddening of the skin near the edge of his sunglasses, the faint scars at the corner of his eyes. It hit her like a lightning bolt. "No," she gasped, her eyes brimming with tears. "It was you, wasn't it?" Daniel flinched, but didn't deny it. His silence said everything. "You gave me your eyes," she continued, her voice trembling. "All this time I thought I'd lost you, and you were." She was sobbing now, her words stumbling over each other. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you let me thank you?" Daniel turned back toward her, struggling to find the words he'd bottled up for so long. "I couldn't," he finally said, his voice breaking. "You deserved a life with someone whole, someone who could give you more. I didn't want you to feel obligated." Sophie knelt in front of him, placing her trembling hands on his cheeks. "You don't get to make that decision for me," she said fiercely. "I've spent months missing you, aching for you. You think I care about anything else? You're the one I love. You're the one I'll always love." And for the first time since he'd awoken from the surgery, Daniel allowed himself to feel the weight of everything he'd tried to suppress. Pulling her into his arms, he cried, letting his guilt, his fear, and his longing flow freely. They stayed like that for what felt like hours, tangled in each other's arms beneath the autumn tree. In the months that followed, their love only grew stronger. Sophie made sure Daniel never doubted his worth again. And when the time finally came, in a quiet ceremony attended by only their closest friends, Daniel clasped Sophie's hands and slid the ring he'd bought so long ago onto her finger. They spent the rest of their days together, grateful for the trials that had only made their bond unbreakable. And though Daniel's world remained veiled in darkness, Sophie became the light that guided his every step. Their love story, marked by sacrifice and redemption, became one that no one who knew them ever forgot.